politics, as George Washington said, nations have neither permanent friends nor permanent enemies, just permanent interests. And obviously she has her own bias and Trump has his own bias. There's a lot of irony and paradox in there. I don't want to get too politically incorrect. There's a lot of things that Mexico does export to us that isn't quite good for us, but I don't want to get into a polarizing left versus right or Mexico versus US debate. Clearly there is an irony of imposing tariffs on products that are actually from American companies that harm supposedly American, companies like Ford, etc. I think what Trump is trying to do, and I'm not defending him, but I think the argument he's making and the reason for such policies, especially against Mexico, is his ultimate goal in making America great again, whether you buy it or not. His ultimate goal is to reshore production and companies and the C-suites and the manufacturing back to the US. And this is one way to kind of convince them, look, if you're going to produce out of Mexico, why don't you produce out of South Carolina or Detroit or Chicago, etc., or Illinois? It's a very bold statement. You can say many things, love or hate Trump. He does have an agenda this time around, much more clearly than he did in 2016. And if he wants to make America great again and reshore productivity and manufacturing, whether that's through tariffs or whether that's through incentives, or whether that's through convincing the C-suite, which sold the American dream outside of America, primarily to China after the WTO in 2000, 2001, when we said, oh, great, China and all these other countries are going to be buyers of American blue jeans and products, when in fact they became manufacturers of American blue jeans and products. And Trump wants to reverse that. That was a C-suite executive decision because executives are paid on share prices. Labor is cheaper in El Salvador, Mexico, and in Asia. And so that wasn't necessarily Bill Clinton's fault entirely. It was also the billionaires on the S&P that wanted to have better share price salaries by outshoring labor. And I think what Trump is trying to do on the positive side of these tariffs is convince companies in the world that we're focusing on America, we're focusing on American productivity, American manufacturing, reshoring jobs. Again, my argument is, and it's not to be anti-Trump or pro anything else, it's just that's expensive and that takes more than one term. We could argue about tariffs all day long. I know with the new Treasury Secretary that he wants to bring in, he wants to be more selective with the tariffs and which countries, not just blanket tariffs across the board. And there's room to, quote unquote, make a deal, so to speak. Right now, Trump is doing what he does best, putting his chest out, puffing his chest out, making strong statements and getting strong reactions. And it's going to cost a lot of money. It's going to be very inflationary. I'd rather see executive margins go down and more American jobs created. I mean, millions of jobs were lost in the Midwest where I'm from. I saw it with my own eyes when we, made the American dream in China many years ago. So I have no problem. I think the executive salary, the ratios from executive salaries to mid-level and median employment or employees. My grandfather was at Ford during the McNamara era. At that time, the ratio of management to median employee ratio was 32-1, which was pretty high. Now it's 320-1. And in the case of Bezos, I've 7 or 8 times, it's 1.2 million to 1. So I think there's something psychopathic about that type of inequality in executive salaries and share price-based salaries. Certainly, I understand capitalism. I'm a capitalist. I would want to try and have the best labor policies I could and the best manufacturing advantages, but I wouldn't do that at the expense of millions of American jobs just so I could have 3 extra houses in Nantucket, Martha's Vineyard, and maybe somewhere out in the Caribbean. I think there's a point where it gets to be feudalism, but the wealth inequality in America, the share price inflation in America, the combination of C-suite M&A deals that were ridiculous post-2008 and post-2020, the kind of executive wealth I see, the wealth inequality I see, the inflation in the NASDAQ and the S&P based on Fed policy, et cetera, that is not capitalism. That is Wall Street socialism. But I'm all in favor of trying to reshore jobs and bring manufacturing back to America. But that, again, is going to be expensive. Like many of Trump's plans, there's going to still be a lot of spending. And he has this Department of Government Efficiency with guys like Elon and Vivek that want to cut 2 million jobs or $2 trillion worth of fat on the budget by basically cutting 75% of the government jobs in D.C., including the Department of Education. A lot of people would be happy with that. There's a lot of, Soviet era-like bureaucracy in D.C. that people want to see cut. If you can cut $2 trillion off the budget, that, again, optically looks great, probably gets a lot of support from people who aren't working for the government. But again, what happens to those people that are unemployed? How do you pay for that? Even if you can cut down some spending, you're going to be raising costs elsewhere. It's like you push here, you pull there. There's a lot of yes, but, yes, but with a lot of these ideas. I think everybody will be affected because obviously the price of goods coming in, because we're a major importer from a lot of products that were once made in America that have American labels that are now made in China and elsewhere. And those products are now going to cost more. That may incentivize some of those companies to reshore their labor back in the U.S. But if you want to talk about growth, I go back to David Hume in the 1750s. I go back to Reinhardt and Rogoff. I go back to von Mises. You can't get growth when your debt to GDP crosses the 110, 120% Rubicon. I mean, once you cross 100%, growth slows by 1/3. But if Trump wants to cut the fat and kill the swamp and drain the swamp, and if Vivek and Elon, want to cut trillions of dollars out of DC, a couple of things you got to keep in mind. All you got to do is reduce interest rates by 25 basis points, because every time you bring interest rates down by 25 basis points, that takes about 25 billion of expenses off the interest expense on our debt. So 25 billion in interest expense just by a 25 basis point cut is a lot easier than that many jobs you have to lose. You have to fire a lot of people in DC to come up with 25 billion. The monetary policy might be a fast way to do it. Again, I have nothing against cutting waste and fat in the swamp. But if you really want to go after the swamp, you got to go after Vanguard, State Street, BlackRock. You have to go after Big Pharma. You have to go after the K Street lobbyists. Ironically, crypto is the biggest lobbyist for Trump this year. If you really want to get growth, you've got to cut waste, you've got to cut spending, you got to promote growth, but you can't promote growth with a debt to GDP this high. It's absolutely the craziest time I've ever seen in a macro setting. It's the craziest geopolitical scene. It's the craziest geoeconomic scene. Yes, tariffs will, I think, be inflationary. Reshoring jobs will be inflationary. But when you really want to get growth, someone has to sit down, someone who is not a former hedge fund manager at the Department of Treasury, which is still better than Yellen, anything is, but someone has to sit down like a von Mises and sit down, or like a Javier Milei, and tell Trump, look, if you want to get growth, you got to cut the debt to GDP ratios. That takes more than 4 years. There's a lot of hype. There's a lot of hysteria. There's a lot of excitement. There's a lot of new cojones, so to speak, in DC right now. But I honestly think, and I'm not trying to rain on the parade of the excitement for Trump, but you can't get growth with this much debt. You simply can't. Let's come back down to reality. Trump wants to end the war. Great. He's got tariffs. He wants tax cuts. He's deregulation. He's going to be a spender. He's pro oil and gas. All these things I think are exciting, and they're at least a stance. We have a stance now. And I've said many times, I feel sorry for whoever gets elected in this recent election, because you're walking in to probably 36, 37 trillion by the time you're in the White House, whether that was Harris, Biden, or Trump. I've said kind of truculently that that's like becoming the captain of the Titanic after you've hit the iceberg. The thing that no one talks about, whether it's here in London with the Labour and the Tories, or in DC with the left and the right during the campaigns, no one talked about the real elephant in the room, which isn't Republican, it's the debt. And anyone facing 36, 37 trillion in public debt doesn't have a lot of options. Trump is certainly going to blitzkrieg through there faster than anyone else. He's going to make big decisions. He's going to make big headlines. There's still going to be major costs. And I'm not trying to be negative for negative sake. I'm just trying to be realistic in a nonpartisan way. I don't think the way out of a debt crisis is to tax more. I don't think taxing the rich or taxing the middle class less or taxing the rich more, certainly that has optics, because I'm a big fan of the middle class. I truly am. I come from that world, from the Midwest. But we've seen over and over that doesn't lead to more growth. It just leads to more very wealthy people finding more and more clever lawyers, as Trump himself admitted, to get away from the taxes or find ways around the Internal Revenue Code. And that's what Trump admitted in his famous debate with Hillary Clinton. The wealthy will always figure out a way. I mean, he's promised to go back to the 2017 tax cuts and make those permanent. If anything, that could incentivize, more speculation. It could incentivize more optimism, more tailwinds for a market that's already, as Jeremy Grantham says, grotesquely overvalued. But again, that goes into the conversation on the markets. But the markets aren't the economy. If spending went into manufacturing, if spending went into hiring labor in the U.S., I'd be all in favor of that. If it's just going to go into inflating a bigger and bigger S&P and NASDAQ bubble, I don't think that's going to help Main Street. Helps the 401ks, but the average family going to Costco trying to get groceries doesn't even have a 401k. They don't have an equity account versus a bond account to debate about. They don't have a Bitcoin account. They don't have a gold account. So, we've got to get back to the reality that I see in the Midwest that people don't see on the West Coast or the East Coast, that I see in Germany and Frankfurt that you don't see in Berlin. It's such a wealth divide in Europe and the U.S., but it's extreme in the U.S. But I think just taxes, just tariffs, it's a very complicated topic, but it really is, where's the spending going? Where's the cuts coming from? And will the spending just go into inflating the C-suites and more S&P inflation, or will it go into smart spending in the Rust Belts and in productivity and in hiring Americans for American jobs? I believe Trump wants to do that. Let's see if he can. Well, it is the best horse in the glue factory. Again, it's a tried cliche, but I've said it for years and I'll say it again. On a relative basis, there's nothing better than the US dollar. If I were an American living in Argentina or living in Istanbul, I'd certainly prefer a dollar over a peso or a lira. But on a relative basis, there's no beating the dollar. It is king. On an individual basis, in isolation, it's still losing its purchasing power as we speak. It just is. The DXY is a 3-year high. It doesn't surprise me at all for a number of reasons right now, but it's so crazy because even Trump wants a weaker dollar. His new Treasury Secretary wants a weaker dollar. He wants looser policy from the Fed, whether he tries to appoint a Fed chair or not. We don't want too high a yields. That makes our interest expense unpayable. It makes our exports more expensive. And even foreigners, this is the paradox. It's yes, but. Foreigners won't buy a U.S. Treasury unless there's a risk premium on it, unless there's a good yield. But at the same time, there's $14 trillion in dollar-denominated debt. If yields go too high, it gets too hard for foreigners to pay back the debt. It's a constant paradox because we're in such a debt trap that whatever positive thing you can say about policy X has a negative thing about policy X. And you got to look at it in so many different ways. I don't even think anyone, even Harris, didn't want a strong dollar. In this, the dollar debate, from Brent Johnson, who's always, the poor guy's always on the witness stand on this, I think there's no doubt to his point that there is a lot of demand for that dollar. It is the king of liquidity. It is what everyone spends with internationally. It's still king of SWIFT. We can talk about the petrodollar. It's still a big player. It's still the world reserve currency. It's not going away anytime soon. But there is this great sucking sound from the derivative market, from the Eurodollar markets, and frankly, from the oil markets. But what we're seeing is there's also a debate whether it's the Eurodollar market creating demand or whether the loss of love for the U.S. Treasury and the lack of love for the U.S. Treasury is actually going to hurt the dollar in the long run. So it's which happens first. But again, I'm not arguing for the end of the U.S. dollar or the death of the U.S. dollar or the end of the world reserve currency. I do think the forces in the oil markets, I do think the forces in the BRICS Plus nations, I do think the forces in the unloved U.S. Treasuries and the fact that the central banks in the East in particular are dumping U.S. Treasuries, that China and Japan are dumping U.S. Treasuries, all that adds a lot of supply. It pushes up yields. It could really affect, if there's less demand for the U.S. Treasury, there's going to have to be some way to create demand for that Treasury. That means we're going to have to print money to the moon to support the bond market that's unloved internationally. It's a constant set of paradoxes. If we keep seeing yields spiking because there's less and less demand for our IOUs, we're going to have to buy those IOUs ourselves. We can do it through indirect QE for only so long, through the short end of the curve, through the TGA, through the repo markets. But eventually, I believe we're going to hit that, mouse click button at the Eccles building and print money like we've never seen before. As Paul Tudor Jones said, the end game, all roads lead to inflation.